Welcome back, everybody. In this section, we are going to talk about a big feature of React called hooks. Now, hooks is a new feature that was introduced in February of 2019 with React 16.8. Hooks is a really interesting feature, especially on its impact in the React community. It aims to replace the way that we write certain components as well as how we write our applications that is a little different from how we've currently written our components and code up until now. It is important that I mention, though, that right now the community is very divided on how to use hooks and whether or not they're actually worth replacing, and to what extent to replace our existing applications code with hooks-related code. And we'll talk about all of that while we actually learn how to use hooks. But before we apply and convert our Crown clothing application over to using some hooks, we're going to test and play around with the base hooks first so we understand what they do and how to use them, because they do have a bit of caveats to them that we gotta understand before we start replacing our code base with these hooks. So in this little quick test create React app application, we have just this basic component that has a header with a name value, and then a button that when clicked should set this value to something else, in this case, Andre. Now this functionality is not in yet, but we need to explore how we would do this using a non-hooked approach in order for us to understand how hooks differ in how we use them. So let's go to the application. Now, normally, all we do if we were to solve this using the React code that we're comfortable with is we would use something like a class component where we would set an internal state of name to the value of Yihua. We would display that name, and then when we click our button, we simply call this.setState and we change name to the value that we want, in this case, Andre. The thing is, though, that this class component is clunkier than a functional component that we would write. But this is the only type of component that we can use if we wanted to leverage internal state in our components. A lot of the React core team that built the Hooks API were thinking and getting feedback from the community that class components and their lifecycle methods particularly are kind of confusing because of how we have to determine the order in which these lifecycle methods are going to fire, right? We don't know where we should be doing different functionality of our component in what lifecycle method. Depending on the kind of feature that you're building, it actually becomes very confusing about which lifecycle methods to use. And then the fact that we're keeping track of state and how state triggers re-renders, it's all things that a lot of developers struggle with. So the React team thought, well, maybe there's a way for us to simplify this. And their solution was hooks. So that's the thing to understand about hooks. Hooks is a way for us to write functional components, but gain access to new functionality that was previously only available to us if we wrote class components. So that's the big caveat. We cannot use hooks inside of class components. We can only use them inside of functional components. And we only have access to hooks again if we're running React version 16.8 or higher. If you join a project that uses an older version of React, unfortunately you won't have access to hooks. But it's still important to learn because the community and the React core team as a whole are saying that hooks are here to stay. Now, in order for us to use hooks, we have to import them in from the React library. And there's actually two main hooks we're going to look at. The first hook we're going to look at is the useState hook. And we import it like so. Now, useState is exactly like it sounds. It allows our functional components to have access to internal state features that we could only leverage before using class components. And the way that useState works is that it is a function that gets a parameter. But before we explore what that parameter is, we got to know what useState gives us back. useState gives us back an array with two values in it. And in order for us to understand these two values, we will actually need to first explore array destructuring. So if you've not heard of array destructuring, it's very similar to object destructuring that we're completely familiar with now. Let's say we have an example of some array which is equal to an array of 3 numbers. If we wanted to set each of those elements in this array to a constant variable that we have access to in our application, we can use what's called array destructuring and set them like this. So very similar to the syntax of our object destructuring and then pointing to an object to cast that object's properties as our constant. We do this in the order inside of square brackets that we want the const variables to point to in their respective positions of the array we're pointing to. So if we type this, we'll see that A now equals 1, B now equals 2, and C now equals 3. So this is pretty much array destructuring. It just allows us to set variables inside of this square bracket to certain elements in an array. Now, useState gives us back two parameters inside of our array. So we destructure these two things that we get back. The first one is going to be the state value itself that we're trying to set. Now we can name this whatever we want, right? But it's pretty much going to be the variable that we want our state to hold. So here, for example, in the context of our application, we're trying to set a name, so I'm going to call it name. The second thing we get back from useState is a function that allows us to set this property. And this property I'm going to call setName. So typically we want to be very explicit about what these two consts that we're getting back will be. Now what we pass into useState is going to be the value that we want the initial value of this state to be. So for example, we're trying to set a string. I'm just going to set useState and the initial value to a string value of Yihua. And now I'm actually able to use these values inside of my component, and this will now equal that state value. And if I wanted to change that value, I simply just call our new setName feature and then pass it the value I want to change this name value to. So now I can just set it to Andre. This is equivalent to this. It's the same thing. The only main difference is that now we have a functional component that is leveraging this internal state. And we'll see that when I click my button, it does change the state of my new functional component. The thing about useState here is that typically if we had multiple values, we would have to put them all into the same state object. And then we would, for example, if I also wanted an address, I would have to do it like this. And then if I needed to set the state of this address, right, I would make for example, just another button. And this would be set address. And what I would have to do is manually still just change the object value that I'm trying to point to in this state. But I would still be calling the same set state. The difference now is that we're able to use this useState hook as many times as we want to instantiate new values and new setter functions for our state. So if I wanted to duplicate that feature in our functional component, I would just make a new useState hook and say set address here and set this to Amsterdam. And then I would simply use the new set address and change this value, right? And get the same functionality. In fact, it's preferred that we use more set states and break apart our states that we're trying to store on our components rather than, for example, store really deeply nested objects. And that is a recommendation, but not necessarily something that the React team is enforcing, but it's a thing to keep in mind regarding how we use the useState hook. But it's a pretty simple hook. In fact, all the hooks are pretty simple to use. There's just caveats about how to use them. But the useState one is definitely the most simple. If we wanted to set more states, we're totally able to do so, right? Just calling useState as many times as we need to set new values, as well as their own setter functions. But this is the main thing about the useState hook. It just gives our functional components access to the state features that we had before on a class component. And the times when we would use this useState hook is if we were trying to build a feature or a component that needed local state inside of its component, but it didn't need any lifecycle methods. That's the main time we would use the useState hook. Now, in our next lesson, we are going to explore the next hook, which is the useEffect hook. And that one actually tackles using component lifecycle methods or similar implementations to lifecycle methods from our classes into functional components. So let's tackle that one next.